Good morning, good afternoon, good evening. Welcome to this episode of Trade Winds. My name is Cecilia Malmström. I'm a non-resident senior fellow at the Peterson Institute for International Economics in Washington. Today, we're going to talk about digital trade and big tech. Trade in services has since a long time surpassed trade in commodities. Much of this growth stems from digital trade, which carries large potential benefits for innovation and growth, but also practical solutions to everyday problems. But digital technology, especially what we call the big tech, also bring challenges of governance and regulation as they penetrate even deeper into citizens' private lives. There are initiatives globally and overall in the European Union, trying to impose platform responsibility, increased transparency, and to regulate competition via its Digital Service Act, Digital Markets Act, and there's the Artificial Intelligence Act and the Data Protection GDPR. The new US administration has voiced a lot of criticism vis-à-vis the EU laws and see them as a trade obstacle. And President Trump has referred to the EU laws as an obstacle to trade and sort of embedded in his reciprocal tariffs. While innovation in this area is, of course, of utmost importance, and the EU is lagging behind China and US in this regard, the questions about accountability are becoming even more important. How can we find a balance between innovation and governance? And is this even a dichotomy, or shall we discuss it in different parts? Well, I have two amazing panelists who will help us to decompose these questions today. We have Emily Benson, who is head of strategy at Minerva Technology, Policy and Advisors. She previously ran the project on trade and technology at the think tank CSIS. And she has also been part of a team at Department of Commerce focused on geopolitical risks in supply chains. We have Marietje Schaake, who is a non-resident fellow at Cyber Policy Center at Stanford University, and also a fellow at the Institute for Human-Centered Artificial Intelligence. She is the author of the recent book, The Tech Coup, and has been a member in the European Parliament for 10 years. And you're both very welcome. So let's start with the basics. When we talk about digital trade, what do we actually mean? Is it cloud, telecom, service providers, blockchains? Emily, how would you define it?
Sure. Well, thank you. And thank you so much for including me in today's discussion. It's just such a great experience to get to be with you and, of course, Marietje, two real rock stars at the intersection of trade and technology. So this is my earlier life dream come true. It's really fantastic to be here. So thank you. I think I'd like to start out with a couple of ways to think about digital trade. First is definitional, then a couple of distinctions, and then what makes it different these days from our typical discussion of commodity-based trade. So when we think about digital trade, I think we can bucket it pretty clearly into some typical buckets that include e-commerce, so purchasing of online goods, also digital services, whether that's cloud computing or streaming, digital products like software, ebooks, data flows, of course, the information that keeps companies up and running, and of course, digital platforms that enable a lot of the aforementioned areas of digital trade. I think one thing that's important here is that a lot of this is cross-border business-to-business digital trade. Consumers certainly get a lot of attention. Europeans buying goods on American platforms that are US headquartered, deriving income from sales and advertising in foreign jurisdictions. But I think there's a bigger kind of under-discussed element to digital trade. And that's that even if you're a European company buying goods or services through a digital platform, oftentimes that platform is American. And so Americans are really facilitating even B2B transactions in foreign markets. And so you could think about this in a way of how do you transact in the event that an American company is no longer able for various reasons, mostly regulatory in nature, to operate in a certain marketplace. And so there's been a lot of discussion in recent years about whether or not we should treat these large tech firms as sort of an underpinning mechanism of the architecture of the internet and the digital economy overall. And I do think that that's an important discussion to have. One other distinction I would draw between digital trade, as we've typically defined it, and commodities-based trade is that digital trade is becoming increasingly geopolitical. This goes back, of course, to the 2013 Snowden revelations about US electronic surveillance, but also both governments on both sides of the Atlantic are increasingly looking at digital trade as an extension of national power. The more digital authority you have, the better you can protect your national essence of the way you go about governing. The last distinction I would draw is that we tend to think of digital trade as something that's out there, this invisible cloud that's exceptionally difficult to define. And I think something there is that a lot of this is still underpinned by very physical trade, chips that enable it, subsea cables that enable 99% of international data transactions. And so if you look at this, a lot of it still does go back to that very rote physical trade, which has come under new pressure, certainly in the US-China context and increasingly in the US-EU context.
Thank you. We'll come back a little bit to the difficulties to regulate this and so on. But I wanted to ask you, Marici, this is becoming an increasing part of trade overall. I am in Washington right now, and how now everybody talks about tariffs on commodities. But digital trade is actually growing so much all over. How do you see the trends evolving this?
Well, I think we can't see tech as a sector anymore. It's really a layer, like a foundational aspect of every part of our economy, but also of our governments, of our lives as people, because of the way we work, the way we engage with friends, the way we plan our weekend trips or our shopping. And so the consequences of the dependence that we have, looking at this from a European point of view, amidst this, trade war that you are pointing to, it means that from a variety of perspectives, our dependence, reliance on US tech has become a vulnerability. There's been a lot of discussion, of course, about why it hasn't helped the European economy. So if you think about the Draghi report that points to the fact that the European economy is not as competitive as, for example, the American, then the tech aspect is an important part of that. But I think it's important to remark now that national security concerns are growing around the dependence because of the fear that on the one hand, tech CEOs like Elon Musk, that now also plays a key role in the US government, have their own political agendas, geopolitical agendas, and will not hesitate to leverage the power through their companies towards that agenda. And of course, if you look at the influencing of the German elections or the discussions about whether Starlink should be available over Ukraine, then you can see that the consequences of that geopolitical pressure can be serious. And, this is one CEO, you could argue, well, that's unique, but it's actually not so unique anymore since we've seen the CEOs of tech companies lining the front rows of the inauguration of Donald Trump. Since Elon Musk plays this critical role, we see a sort of synergy between political power and Silicon Valley power that is swept up in this whole trade war. So, for example, the company Meta, which includes Facebook, Instagram, and WhatsApp, has representatives urging the Trump administration to label sanctions over antitrust violations by the European Commission as a non-tariff barrier. And so this would be an unprecedented read of what sanctions are in the competition and antitrust sphere. And so we just see pressure around everything that is digital. And it's a kind of pressure that is very easy to wage on the part of the Americans, whether it's companies or the White House, because Europe is so dependent on US technologies. And so it is no surprise that in Brussels, the name of the game is now digital sovereignty, strategic autonomy, a real need to be less vulnerable to these kinds of pressures and risks that come from the tech foundation of our societies that is largely American and has become a vulnerability from the perspective of Europeans, given the pressures that the US can wage through them.
And in the upcoming trade war right now, I mean, we're all trying to see where it's going to lead and whether there will be an agreement or a deal or so on. But there are talks in Brussels about using a new instrument that we have called the anti-coercion instrument. And in that, technical digital services and others could actually be targeted if you want to impose some sort of countermeasures. Now, I know this is not on the agenda for the moment, but it's being discussed, and I get a lot of questions about it here in Washington as well. How would that work? Would it be an effective tool to target American digital trade, or would it, bearing in mind that the dependencies that we have in Europe on this, would it rather be shooting ourselves in the foot?
Is the question for me or for Emily?
Yeah, well, you can start. Yes.
Okay. Well, I think we are finding ourselves at an interesting crossroads because, for example, Emily and you mentioned the AI Act on the part of the EU, new regulations, and I think this anti-coercion instrument is also, quite detailed, quite rules-based, the same way the AI Act is, about the nitty-gritty of how would you want to put obligations on AI companies to mitigate risk from the putting onto the market of AI products and services. Now, I think those instruments made sense in, I guess, the old world, but I think the questions have almost escalated to another level now. And they are much more about, are these products and services desirable at all? And how can we develop alternatives rather than saying, hey, we want better behavior from the US tech companies when they come onto the European market. So I think the discussions are now much more about how can we replace the dependence rather than how can we strike back in the context of the trade war. So I also hope that the focus will be much more on investments, on looking at how we can, in a more sustainable way, deal with this huge destruction of the transatlantic relation by the Trump administration, rather than resorting to the tools that worked in the old world when, in principle, we shared a common outlook on the world, common values, which of course, has dramatically and in my opinion, depressingly changed over the past couple of months.
That's very interesting. We'll come back to this, but can I just ask you, Emily, there has been a lot of criticism, as Marietje said, and we can also hear about it all the time, towards the European regulations by Elon Musk has voiced it, but also others. Why are they so critical towards the EU laws?
Well, I think there's a certain lack of appetite, to put it that way, in Washington in general about regulation. That's always been a very profound difference between the way that Washington, Brussels, and member state capitals go about economic governance. The United States, from the very birth of the country, has been go westward, have small government, build first and figure it out later. And this inherently contradicts the European Union's precautionary principle, which is essentially, let's make sure something is a net benefit for society before we roll it out en masse. That is not a new philosophical divide. And I think this is really coming into greater focus when we bring in this weaponization possibility, where the US has certain levers that it could turn off via a kill switch. The European Union similarly has actually a fairly robust arsenal of tools that they could use that would imperil the United States economy similarly. I personally don't think it will get to that. I think both sides are coming to realize that they both have extraordinary power. And this is kind of an under-discussed feature of the European Commission. And it's, as you say, come up most recently in the anti-coercion instrument. But there are so many dependencies when we have such a close trading relationship that a further escalation could be extraordinarily difficult, especially for consumers who would have to face rising costs, where replacements would provide probably less services on the short term and at a price premium. I'd also just like to go back very briefly to the anti-coercion instrument, which very famously in the press recently has been described as the EU's bazooka instrument. I am not completely bought into that analogy for one main reason, which is that it's essentially the mirror Section 301 of the United States that is intended to provide broad swath authority to implement remedy measures in the event of unfair trade practices. And the origin story of that actually is from the US-EU context and the EU revelation that, well, they probably should have something that looks and feels like a Section 301. And so I think the way that we think about this in trade law tends to be a little bit exaggerated. Sure, it could have punitive effects in the transatlantic relationship, and I think the net effect would be further retaliation. But at the end of the day, it is mirroring a statute that the US has had for a long time. Where I think we get into a little bit of a trickier space is if we go beyond the anti-coercion instrument, we go beyond Section 301, and we start to actually weaponize the platforms themselves, which would get into completely uncharted territory, especially in the physical context, because this would extend far beyond cloud services or digital platforms where consumers exchange ideas and goods. So I think this is kind of an opening salvo to say, look, we can match your existing trade authority, but what comes next could be in many ways more severe.
Yeah, but if we put the current trade tensions aside for a moment and look at the actual scene that you both have outlined, there is a growing concern among consumers that even if we enjoy all these services in our daily life, that there is also a governance problem, that you would want certain kind of responsibility and accountability. And this is a debate also held at the US. It comes and goes in a way. You had this Clean Network initiative, and which was actually, it was under the Trump 1 administration that went through. And you have the Senate and the House are regularly organizing hearings and questionings about this. So it's not a only European phenomena that people are concerned. Is there any way that you can see a stricter regulation coming out here also in the US, on the US side? Emily?
Yes, I certainly think so. And this is a big distinction between the European approach and the American approach. The Europeans have been very afraid over time about a potential weaponization of US tech platforms and a lack of regulation on those platforms for a litany of reasons. I think one thing that's changed in my observation in the last few years in Washington, really kicking off during the first Trump administration, but continuing under Biden and certainly experiencing a resurgence today, is fear about Chinese surveillance, Chinese weaponization, and the embedding of malicious Chinese software or hardware in the American tech stack. And in some ways, the European Union has been lengths ahead of the United States about having discussions about privacy, responsible AI governance, and the focus from Washington on Beijing has really cemented in a lot of policymakers' minds certain vulnerabilities that do come with the tech stack. And so although we're coming at this from different philosophical starting points, it is beginning to land in Washington that the tech stack invites serious vulnerabilities over the long run. And we saw that, as you mentioned, in the Clean Network initiative, which is essentially to build large-scale infrastructure without Chinese inputs, famously in the Huawei context, but also increasingly in expanded IoT domains. So one policy change that went very much under the news during the Biden administration was FCC guidance about baby monitors. And the idea here was to create a mutually agreed upon standard where consumers go onto a large platform like Amazon to buy baby monitors that are maybe $12 or $13, very affordable, but they connect to a foreign country that is gathering information about baby monitors. This is a completely new approach that the US hasn't really taken in the past. And what that would have done is create a standard, kind of an artificial ecosystem, positively inducing consumers to reconsider the security of IoT devices. And that was just guidance that came out. Where we see that evolve more on the regulatory path, of course, is from this ICTS office inside the Bureau of Industry and Security, which also emanated originally from the Trump administration, but got fully funded and staffed under Biden. And the idea here is that we need to take a much closer look at IoT devices more generally. If you look at automobiles, for example, they're basically entertainment centers on wheels. They can listen, transmit information. They can provide very, very granular information about where you are, how quickly you drive. And it also can include embedded software capable of being bricked and a host of other vulnerabilities. And so I think what we'll continue to see is an expanded use of these really Internet of Things based policies that will continue to ensnare a broader number of sectors as it progresses.
That's interesting. The European Union, as you said, and as we know, have tried to regulate this. I mean, parting from protection of privacy, but also making sure that there is responsibility for the big platforms and accountability as well. Marietje, you said that ideally, in your view, and sorry if I put words in your mouth, that we would move from that US dependency and try to develop a more European autonomy in this field, while also addressing all these things that come up almost daily. We have, you mentioned the elections, but also the interference of who actually who has access to all the data that is flying through the cables all over the world, and what does it do to privacy? How can we do this in Europe? You referred also to the Draghi report, which is a report by a former Italian prime minister focusing on how Europe can become much better in innovation and competitiveness and so on. So how can we do this at the same time, making sure that we have that responsibility and that is reinforced, but also developing European tools? Because as today we are very dependent on American data technology, and most Europeans actually use it on an, if not daily, hourly basis.
Yeah, so the notion of network effect, why does everybody use it? Because everybody uses it is sort of well at work. It has a very strong pulling factor, and then contracts like, for the software suites that we use at work are typically very binding. So they lock in consumers, and they, lead to updates and new additions to the services that are available that make it really hard to untangle. But in listening to Emily talk about, the way in which people appreciate more and more what vulnerabilities come from using various technologies across the tech stack, and how in the US the perspective is very much on China, is an interesting sort of analogy to follow, because even if tensions were there around, for example, data protection between the EU and the US under previous administrations, the EU has never proposed to ban American services, while, of course, the TikTok ban was initiated by Donald Trump previously, later reversed. But the dependency of the US on Chinese tech is significantly less than the EU's dependence on US tech. And still, it's leading to big political discussions and serious geopolitical measures. And so I think what we're seeing in Europe now is a painful realization of sort of over-trusting the alliance between the US and the EU, and the role that tech played in that. And so I think what's needed first on the political level is a full acceptance of this reality. I still hear a little bit of nostalgia or hope in the kinds of political statements that come out of Brussels when people still say, well, let's try to, continue on the basis that we've been, you continue to hold on to the transatlantic alliance and so on. But I just don't think that that's going to be a strategy. Hope cannot be a strategy here. We need to see a bridging of concerns over national security, which are still handled on the national level according to how the EU is organized, and the sort of strength that the EU level brings on the market, the single market, and on the shared Charter for Fundamental Rights. So typically what we've seen regulations around from the EU, it's either economic or harmonizing to continue to build the single market, or to better protect rights. We are typically less powerful, literally, because we are fragmented, divided over how we manage national security. And that explains why, for example, now you can see discussions in Italy ongoing about the use of Starlink, while the majority of European governments may actually think that that's not such a clever thing to consider right now for national security reasons. And so I think what's really important is, one, a realization of how serious this is, two, a bridging of the fragmentation of national security, and two, inform decisions from that perspective. So yes, the Draghi report kind of started to build political momentum towards greater independence of US tech, and I think that was important. But what has happened since that report was published casts every urgency that we feel in Europe now much more through a national security lens, because even if we don't know for sure what's going to happen. Are these US technologies going to be weaponized? Are there vulnerabilities that can be abused? Will tech CEOs act like independent geopolitical players at the expense of the EU's interest? The risk is so significant that we just can't accept the risk from a European point of view. So I think that that is reason enough to act, but it will take a lot of work and leadership to get from where we are today to that sort of point on the horizon of digital autonomy, or a Euro stack that people talk about now, which I think is a really helpful strategic concept. But we still lack a sort of breaking down into what investments go where. What do we find when we stress test the European dependence? In other words, what's the status quo in Sweden versus Germany, in Spain versus France? What contracts exist? What risks do we see of the various dependencies? Where do alternatives exist? Where can we go first? What is needed to help that transition? And all those kinds of decisions. So I think the big strategic picture is becoming clear, very urgent, a big political momentum, and now it needs to be translated into concrete steps that are sometimes going to be challenging because of the way the EU is made up, namely national security not decided on the union level. And so maybe, Cecilia, if you're not only going to moderate, you can shed some light on that from your experience.
Well, that is certainly interesting, because it's a dilemma, as you say. National security is on the national level, and it's becoming increasingly acute. But the investments in innovation and the technology development will be both national, but also on the European side. And right now, I think we are seeing some initiatives coming out of Brussels when it comes to innovation and investments, but there's a huge discussion on money. In a parallel universe, European states are also discussing how to invest more in the defense area, and we're talking about billions and billions and billions. And that is both national budget and European budget, and loans and investment and public-private partnerships. But then we also need all these investments in technology and innovation, and that is is really hard to square that circle, because in the end, even with the best intentions and the best political priorities, you need the money, and where that is going to come from right now is not clear. Would you like to comment this, Emily? How you see this discussion evolving in Europe, and is this something that you see that behind, or rather below, the big political discussions that we are having now are very focused on reciprocity, tariffs, and competitiveness and all that? There must be a layer of people who are also discussing these issues. How can we, everything from parents saying that the kids are spend too much time on screens. That's a discussion that is happening all over the world. Then how can we how can we sort of disconnect a little bit more from the dependence that we are seeing? We certainly see it in a debate that is going on in the UK, in Canada, and elsewhere as well.
Yeah, so I think there are a lot of elements there that predate the current set of circumstances. And if you go back to the GDPR days, which seems like such a long time ago in the policy domain, there were a lot of questions about building up tech champions and unicorns and let's make this happen. That didn't really come to fruition. It was sort of a similar story with Gaia X, this joint European cloud initiative that didn't materialize. More recently, something that I think kind of faded from public view is the EU Chips Act equivalent. Here in the US, of course, we spent $52 billion to essentially affirmatively induce onshoring of certain chip production. The European Union stood up a similar program, and it encountered a lot of the issues that each of you has just outlined, which is it's actually really complicated to get a diverse set of countries to pitch in to a common fund and then to create the domestic regulatory environment to make sure that the chip companies can actually grow. The chip industry writ large is also very subject to huge swings in the market. And so it creates a lot of uncertainty over the long run about the viability of certain investments. So long story short, a lot has to go right. In today's context, actually last week, the European Commission unveiled what's called the AI continent. And this is quite interesting because this goes back to an earlier comment I made about the intersection of digital worlds versus hardware trade. And what the European Union has realized is that it actually doesn't really currently have the physical infrastructure to create a hyperscaler ecosystem. If you want to be the EU that is leading in the future of large language models that can compete in this intangible geopolitical context, you have to physically have large data centers that are European. And a lot of what we do in my current position is help companies look at their entire tech stack for AI. The way I think about this is copper wire all the way through cloud service end user. And there are a lot of complicated steps in between that rely on adequately priced goods that come from sometimes 44 countries. Chips on average, just a normal kind of non-advanced chip goes through 44 countries if you take into account all of the parts and components, the packaging, the shipping, the design element, which typically has occurred in the United States. And so you're looking at a very, very complicated set of circumstances. And on top of that, you throw in trade uncertainty with changing tariff rates, exemptions that actually turn out to be a Section 232 investigation. And so it's actually quite complicated for a bloc like the European Union to say, look, we're aligning regulatorily across the bloc. We also have all of the inputs that we need. And on top of it, we have the talent. And the European Union last week recognized a lot of these issues and putting forward this new plan. So I'm very excited to see if, given current new geopolitical pressures, this actually does result in a new third way between the US and China. Again, a lot would need to align, but that's certainly the next big area to watch.
How do you see this, Marietje?
Well, I agree. You know, there's a lot of activity in the EU to look at how both the EU's capabilities can be boosted through a variety of steps, and the risk can be mitigated. But it will not be easy. But I think, you know, there's a sort of catalyst effect that we may anticipate now. If governments are going to end up asking different criteria when they procure tech services, I think procurement is sort of a secret weapon of change, because we cannot underestimate how much money is being spent by governments on tech. And of course, this really touches the very most sensitive challenges of, you know, how much trust can we place in the handling of data, of the functioning of tech products and services, and can they be instrumentalized or weaponized in the worst case? And if governments are going to switch or apply different criteria to contracts, or even dismantle contracts on the basis of national security threats, then that will send a very strong signal to the market. And we already see that investors are paying attention. A lot of volatility in the United States because of policy, and a lot of promise in what can happen in Europe, because we spoke earlier about the mobilizing of funds, the releasing of the budgetary constraints for the purpose of defense. But I think in this context, it's important to note that you can't really say, well, this is where we have a bucket of defense, and that's about tanks and fighter jets and what have you. And then there's a pause, and then we have tech on the other side. These are all very, very much intertwined. Anyone who thinks about warfare or conflict these days and thinks about what is necessary to defend the homeland has to think about technology, has to think about the hybrid aspects. And so one of the characteristics of conflict in the digital domain and of weaponization of technologies is, of course, that civilian tools, everyday products and services can be weaponized. So that, in the old world, let's say, you really needed arms to wage a war. But now you can also leverage social media platforms. You can hack into devices that people are using. People's social media behavior as private citizens is used to gather information about them in the interest of intelligence gathering and, geopolitical strife and so on. And so I would hope that all this vision about better position on the part of the EU and European countries more broadly, including the UK and the context of NATO, to defend itself without relying on the United States also includes that tech component, because it would really be a mistake to view defense through the lens of sort of traditional military equipment and activities. And so if that's the case, and if you can then also show instead of tell what kind of values you want to attach, what kind of principles you want to attach to the role of technology as a government, then major signals will also be sent to the market. If there's then on top of that public investment going into a more digitally sovereign and resilient EU, meaning the intersection of market and defense, then I think between the political momentum, the considerations of national security, and the economic aspects, we can really see serious changes happening. And I think right now the will is there. I mean, because of my book, but also in general, I end up talking to a lot of people, including, ordinary citizens who want to understand what is happening in the United States and what is the power of tech companies and what does it mean for our democracy. There's real discomfort with continuing to use US tech products. And so I don't know to what extent that feels and is appreciated, feels that way in Washington, that is one of the consequences of this administration. But I think the potential for major shifts in the use of technology on the European continent will hopefully, become clear soon, because there are a lot of movements towards one sort of momentum to make that happen.
Well, certainly our friends in Ukraine have realized how important tech and security and defense are, and they are facing those dilemmas every day on the battlefield, but also on the sort of cyber virtual battlefield. And I think they have a lot to teach us on how to look at that sort of holistic perspective. Is this a debate that is reflected a little bit in the US, Emily, that Marietje referred to?
Yeah, certainly. And I should also say that we have our first white paper ever as a team that's come out an hour and a half ago. And so please give it a read. But this is actually one of the main themes that we talk about throughout the report. And it's really situated in US-China competition, but where Europe fits in. And part of our thesis is that the current US approach seems hurried in some ways. There's a lot going on. Tariffs are really dominating the news cycle, but actually there's a very, very clear agenda that's emerged, and it actually makes it easier for companies and countries to be able to navigate the environment. And in my personal opinion, a lot of this goes back to a defense tech revolution. If you look at what's happening, especially on the Eastern battlefront in Ukraine, they've done so much with so little. And a lot of it is leveraging these cloud service providers. Of course, they have a Starlink reliance that's been enabling a lot of their frontline offensive activity. New drones that can be put together in your grandmother's kitchen, for example. And this is really changing the way that we're thinking about the future of defense tech. Already in the first 100 days of the Trump administration, we've seen a complete reversal of a couple of generations of the way that we go about defense procurement. Part of what the White House is doing now is providing guidance to basically streamline DoD acquisition to focus less on the big five defense companies and to focus more on these next generation warfighting capabilities, many of which go back to advanced data leveraging and then advanced drone capabilities and kind of next generation defense. And so if you take this rewrite of the US traditional approach to defense, what we'll see is that data will play an increasingly large role as, the way I think about it, a commodity feeder into this whole ecosystem. And so I would think that even by the end of the year, we would have a completely different concept of what data means in a rote national security context. And so I very much agree.
If we address a little bit the sort of positive aspects of digital trade, facilitating trade, we have seen all over the world there is a discussion in WTO to facilitate digital trade or e-commerce. There are some regional agreements. There's the DIPA agreement to facilitate digital trade between Singapore, Costa Rica, New Zealand, and a couple of other countries, 5 or 6 countries who are really trying to facilitate that. And the EU is also concluding individual data trade agreements lately with South Korea and Japan. So this is a way to sort of facilitate the good use of the digital tools and so on. Do you see any tendency there that they could also be lifted? Because you refer to the old world, Marici, it's changing so quickly right now, that also in that context, we could discuss, if not multilaterally, but at least bilaterally or regionally, the regulation in a way that is would be more prominent than today. And
well,
you've looked at it in your book and elsewhere.
Oh, yeah, sorry. I think we will see a reorientation of who are like-minded partners, partially because, if you look at the world as a whole, then the democracies together are losing strength. And the fact that the US is stepping away from multilateral initiatives like AI governance, for example, because it doesn't want to regulate AI, will also put the onus on other countries that are aligned on wanting to have, for example, safety measures in place for the use of AI, which is something that was actually quite non-controversial until recently. And so I imagine that there will be new alliances across greater geographical distance, hopefully around shared values like respect for the rule of law, international rules-based order, including extending those rules and principles to meaningfully be implemented vis-a-vis the use of technology in our world. There are still huge questions about, for example, how the laws of armed conflict or humanitarian law apply in the digital context. What is a civilian target of a cyber attack, for example, and what should be the consequences when those are attacked? It's pretty clear how an attack on civilian infrastructure is interpreted when it happens with a rocket or with a tank. It's not at all clear, or not in its consequences, when it happens digitally. And on top of that, it's often not as visible as it is with more traditional conflict. So there is a lot of work that remains. And I think that both between like-minded countries, but also countries that have very different political systems and philosophies, there is room for greater collaboration, because just like with climate, the consequences of abuse or harm from the use of technologies or negligence on the part of companies, for example, does not stay restricted to one country or one company. It very easily, ripples or rips through the system. And that is something that companies and governments, citizens and business people all should worry about. And so I hope that while the international rules-based order comes under a new kind of pressure with this U.S. administration, that other countries will step up to come to new kinds of guardrails in this world, and that should include tech. So that's kind of what I hope, but it's pretty early in this dramatic change that we see as a result of the new administration.
Yes, it's hard to see that is around the corner to happen, but it is indeed something that both puts geopolitical risk to supply chains in the actual trade, but also the vulnerability of citizens using it. You've dedicated a lot of time focusing on geopolitical risks in supply chains, Emily. Is this something that has been discussed in this context as well? Sort of the need for some sort of more global rules or attention to this?
Yeah, so one of my hobby horses in Washington is that I think it's time for a new conversation on what constitutes digital trade. If you talk to a lot of the people who have been very active in the space for a while, it comes back to this common refrain: we need to do something on digital. We need to do something digital. And what does that mean?
Exactly. What does that mean?
What is digital? And I think
I'll send you an email.
Yes, exactly. And I think historically that's been a way to push back against data localization policies. In my opinion, that's sort of a last generation approach to the way that we think about digital trade. And this again goes back to the fact that digital trade is inherently physical in nature, because the data centers, the subsea cables that facilitate digital trade are very much something we can touch. We need to source from foreign countries in order to build. And what I am really interested in seeing, especially under this administration, is forward motion on sectoral arrangements. And we saw this to a degree over the weekend, where we saw the 90-day reciprocal tariff pause, then we saw escalation on China, and then actually it got walked back, and a set of items was carved out from these tariffs, including semiconductors, only to say, well, actually, we're going to follow up with a Section 232 investigation on chips. And that actually begs a lot of questions of where is there room to negotiate, particularly on the items that create the foundation of the internet and that create the foundation of our IoT economy. And there are some very creative ideas that are floating out in the ether that are very early stage about creating sectoral arrangements. This has come up quite prominently in the medical supply and active pharmaceutical ingredient conversation in the wake of COVID-19 supply chain crunches, where maybe we actually don't need to be pursuing these comprehensive free trade agreements, but we could create a tariff-free zone on the parts and components that lead to digital end products. And that, of course, comes into great conflict with the WTO. I am skeptical that the WTO will be able to have a very prominent voice in this particular discussion. If the US, for example, were to withdraw or were to seriously withhold funding from its mission at the WTO, which it looks like that could be increasingly possible, that would imperil the ITA agreement that has afforded zero tariff rates on a lot of these technologies that go into creating the digital economy. So if that doesn't exist anymore, if we don't have this multilateral commitment, this legal definition of what constitutes a trade agreement, that actually creates a big opening to rethink the way that we're moving to zero tariffs on these items that underpin the IoT economy. That in turn begs a separate question that's come up very, very frequently, especially in the context of Secretary Raimondo and Executive Vice President Vestager during the last European Commission. And something that they kind of crafted was this idea of a trusted trading partner model, where if you had a trusted chip or a trusted item that underpins this digital economy, then we could move to a different tariff schedule on those items. And that homework, in my opinion, is unfinished. It hasn't really been tested sufficiently in Congress either, which ultimately would have to move forward on a sort of sectoral arrangement, of course, with input from other US agencies. But that's really a space that I'm curious to see how it evolves, because that could open an entirely new chapter for creating carve-outs in the digital economy.
And do you think it will survive the current administration? Or is it sort of below the radar for the moment?
Well, the administration has signaled definitely an openness to negotiating sectoral arrangements. This was included in the America First Trade Policy Executive Order in its first week in the administration. And so I think there's an implicit acknowledgement of, look, we'd like to do something. It probably cannot be comprehensive in a way that the TTIP was, for example. This will not cover all sectors. We've also seen this debate surface very recently in the UK-US context, where there was a limited appetite to pursue some sort of arrangement, especially on artificial intelligence or the digital economy writ large. And pretty soon you had other voices chiming in, well, actually, we need to include agriculture, and then you get back to square one. But at the end of the day, it's very possible that we could see industries get involved to say, okay, we're willing to put up with parts of the agenda, but we need a guarantee on carve-outs to maintain a high trust environment where the goods and services exchange is still able to materialize in a much more certain environment.
Okay, thank you. Before I ask Marietje to comment on that, just to say to the audience that you can type questions in the chat. We have a couple of minutes more if you have questions to our panelists. Marietje, do you think this trusted partnership can be something to build upon?
Well, I just don't know what trust really means today, and I don't think that the U.S. administration is really exuding a lot of trust. So, I recently got an invitation to write a paper about how the U.S. government could, build trusted relationships around AI governance. And, aside from whether I would want to write such a paper, which, I was just wondering what on earth would I write in there? I just think that a lot of these sort of frameworks around, what agreements and rules can lead to presume reliability, presume good faith, presume partnerships that just, are not honored, let me put it in those terms, by this U.S. administration in the way that they were for decades of various U.S. administrations. And so that makes the U.S. an unreliable partner for a lot of countries around the world, and that will have impact across a variety of engagements. And I just think that pressure can only bring the U.S. government so far. Of course, they can use leverage and pressure, and we've seen that unfolding already. But ultimately, that will not lead to the kind of sustainable and, constructive kinds of collaborations that the US, I believe, has benefited from first and foremost over the past decade. So we will have to see also whether there will be alternative, efforts to come to such partnerships and to build those out. It's an interesting time, as the saying goes, but not in a good way. I mean, so many foundations of all the things we're discussing are shaking, and I wonder where it's all leading. But I'm still of the time where we saw trade as a way to cement relations between countries, even if they didn't see eye to eye, and as a way to sort of decrease the chances of conflict because of mutual dependence and because of a buy-in in each other's success and a role back and forth in each other's success. And of course, while we see trade wars emerging, we have to ask ourselves what comes after that, and how will measures that are taken now to actually create more distance between trading partners, how will that distance be shrunk again when the time comes? So I think we're far from those steps, but it doesn't mean that those of us who hope that they will happen shouldn't continue to push for them.
Exactly. No, definitely challenging time for the transatlantic relation, and a lack of trust that I think will take a long time to rebuild. But what we also see if, because there will be a lot of unclarity in the coming days, months, years of what this relation also in trade and other kinds of cooperation will mean. And individual countries are now busy trying to see, can we get deals? Can we find a way to get rid of the tariffs or a peace? But there is also a growing sensation that most countries actually do want to cooperate on a basis that is based on rules, predictability, the multilateral system, more or less as we constructed it together, because it has been beneficial. So maybe we can see sort of, again, the analogy on security, sort of alliance of the willing of countries who do see, and if you come back to digital trade and regulation, that focusing now that there are so many tariffs on goods, facilitating digital trades and getting rid of the sort of more technical obstacles that are there, and that could increase everything from e-contracts to common regulation on spam and so on, that could actually facilitate digital trade, not least for small and medium-sized companies in remote areas as well, but also coming together and seeing, can we do something more about the regulation, the accountability issues, as this is being discussed in more and more countries. Maybe this is a sort of optimistic for the time being, a little bit naive, but to end on a more positive note, is this something you see coming, Emily and Marici, on a final note before we close?
Sure, I'm happy to kick that one off. I think it's easy to get lost in everything is chaotic and we don't know where this will end, and it's a very low trust environment. And I think that could certainly persist for a few more weeks. However, there is tremendous appetite to work more closely together and to avert a ramping up of tensions, particularly in the transatlantic context. Europeans have been in town, it feels like almost daily, negotiating at very senior levels with the White House. The European Union has paused implementation of its retaliatory package. The US has put a pause on these 90-day reciprocal tariffs. That is creating a huge opportunity to see where we can work together. I am very confident, very hopeful and optimistic that we'll be able to reach an agreement that will prevent further escalation.
Well, that's the kind of hopeful message that I really needed, because I worry a great deal about where things are going. And so thank you for that, Emily.
Well, let's end on that positive note. There was a late question, but that was more on the stability of international financing organizations, a little bit outside the topic and hard to answer for the moment, where the financing of IMF and the World Bank and so on is going. Maybe this could be a topic for later discussions. Emily Benson and Marici Schaake, thank you so much for your time. It's been immensely educating for me, and we'll try to end on a positive note on this, but there's certainly a topic that we will need to come back to. So thank you all, and thank you for listening.